The morning of the sale, there were 60 cows nobody wanted. They stood in the far pen at the county livestock yard, the pen they kept for animals that were closer to a problem than a purchase, and the sun had not yet cleared the ridge line, so their breath still showed in the cold. They were thin along the hips and dull in the coat, and several of them stood with their heads low and their ears drooping, and one of them, a black and white cow near the gate, leaned against the rail as though the rail were the only thing keeping her from folding down into the mud. The auctioneer had already worked through the good stock. The heifers with the straight backs and the bright eyes had gone early to the men who came every week, the men who leaned on the same section of fence they always leaned on, and spat and named prices without seeming to move their mouths. Those cattle had brought fair money. These 60 had brought nothing yet, because nobody had bid, because everybody in that yard knew what they were looking at. They were the remainder of a dairy operation 2 counties over that had gone under in the spring, and they had been hauled from barn to barn and yard to yard since April. And somewhere along the way they had picked up a low fever that ran through the herd and never quite left. And the man who bought them for slaughter that morning had walked the pen once, looked at their weight, and shaken his head, and gone to buy something else. So they stood there in the cold with a lot number chalked on a board, and no owner willing to feed them another week. And the auctioneer, more out of duty than hope, opened them at a single $1 for the lot. A young woman climbed the rail on the shaded side of the pen and sat there with her boots hooked on the second board, and looked at those cows for a long time without saying anything. She did not look at the men. She did not look at the auctioneer. She looked at the cows, one at a time, the way you might read the pages of a book you already suspected you would finish. She was maybe 22, in a canvas jacket that had belonged to somebody bigger, and she had a small notebook in her breast pocket that she did not take out. When the auctioneer's chant drifted down to nothing and hung there in the embarrassed quiet, she raised 2 fingers and said $3, and somebody near the coffee urn laughed out loud, a short bark of a laugh, and a big man in a feed store cap said, loud enough to carry, that she'd overpaid by $2.99, and that the only thing those cows would ever produce was a hole in the ground big enough to bury them in. Nobody bid against her. The gavel came down. She had bought 60 sick dairy cows for $3, and the big man in the cap said, to no one and everyone, that he'd give her a month before she came crawling back to sell the fence posts. If you've ever been told that what you have in your hands isn't worth the trouble of keeping it, do me a small favor before we go on. Tap the like button and leave a comment telling me the town you're watching from, because I read every single one and I like knowing where these stories travel. Say the name of your county or your city, and if this one gets to you, share it with somebody who needs it. Now, let's begin. Her name was Della Hart, and she had come back to the farm in March, not because she had a plan, but because there was nowhere else the road seemed to want to carry her. Her mother had left the county years back for a job in the city, and a man who did not last, and Della had grown up half there and half here, spending summers on the ridge with her grandmother while her mother worked. When the phone call came in February that her grandmother had fallen and could not manage the stairs, and when the aunt who was supposed to look in on things stopped answering, Della packed 2 bags and drove the old truck up the mountain and did not plan on staying past the thaw. The farm was 200 acres of hillside pasture and bottomland that the family had held since before anybody living could remember, and most of it had gone to seed and scrub in the years since her grandfather died. The barn was still sound because he had built it to be sound, with beams a grown man could not reach around. But the milking equipment in it was 30 years silent, and the stanchions had rusted, and the whole place smelled of dust and old hay and the particular loneliness of a working farm that had stopped working. Her grandmother Ruth was 81 and moved slowly and spoke less, and she wore the same brown coveralls she had worn for 4 decades, without any self-consciousness at all, because she had earned the right to wear whatever she pleased on ground she had bled into. Della had thought she would stay a few weeks and get the old woman settled and hire somebody local to keep an eye on things, and then drive back down to whatever her life had been. But the weeks stacked up and the mud dried, and the grass came green on the south-facing slopes, and she found she did not want to leave. She could not have told you why in words. It had something to do with the way the light came over the ridge in the morning, gold and slow, and something to do with her grandmother sitting on the porch shelling beans without needing conversation, and something to do with a feeling that had been missing from every apartment and every job in the city, a feeling of being in the one place on earth where her hands were supposed to be. So she stayed. She fixed the fence in the near pasture. She cleaned out the barn. She fed her grandmother and learned again how the old woman took her coffee and where the good spring was and which windows would not close. And she started going down to the livestock yard on sale days, not to buy at first, only to watch, because watching was how she had always understood things. She sat on the rail and studied the animals and studied the men, and she kept her small notebook in her pocket, and after a few weeks she began to notice something the men did not seem to notice or did not care about, which was that the yard was full of good animals that fetched good prices and dull animals that fetched poor ones, and that the difference between them was not always what the men assumed it was. Because Della had a way of looking that was different. She would fix on a cow the way she had fixed on those 60 in the far pen, and she would look past the coat and the weight and the drooping head, and she would look at the frame underneath, the depth of the barrel, the width across the pins, the set of the legs. Her grandfather's books were still up in the house, in a wooden crate in the room off the kitchen that nobody used, and in the long, empty evenings that spring, she had begun reading them, ledgers and breeding records and a stack of yellowed pamphlets from an agricultural college, and one worn notebook in her grandfather's cramped hand that she read the way other people read Scripture. And in that notebook, over and over, in the margins beside cows he had bought 60 years ago, her grandfather had written a phrase. He had written it beside animals that other men had passed over, animals he had bought cheap and turned into the best milkers the county had ever seen, back when the Hart Dairy was a name that meant something. He had written, next to those cows, the words built different. And Della, sitting on the rail at the livestock yard, watching those 60 sick and unwanted animals stand in the cold, had seen the same thing her grandfather had seen, and she had read it in their frames the way he had taught her without ever meaning to teach her, and she had bought them for $3 and let the big man laugh. Getting them home was its own trial. She hired a hauler she could barely afford, a taciturn man named Cletus, who owned a stock trailer and an old diesel truck that started with a sound like an animal in pain, and idled with a knock that her grandmother, watching from the porch, said sounded like it was composing its own obituary. It took 4 trips over 2 days to move 60 head up the mountain, and one of the cows, the black and white one that had leaned against the rail, would not load the first time, and had to be coaxed up the ramp with a bucket of grain and a great deal of patience, and Della found herself talking to her low and steady the whole way up the incline, telling her it would be all right, telling her she was almost home. She did not name them. She had told herself she would not name them, because you did not name what you might lose, and she expected to lose a good number of them, and she held that line. She almost held that line. The black and white one she started calling the leaner in her own head, because of the way she stood, and that was not a name, she told herself. That was a description. When the last trailer load came off the ramp into the near pasture, and the 60 of them stood in Hart pasture for the first time, spread out under the ridge with the good grass under their feet, her grandmother came down off the porch slower than she used to and walked the fence line and looked at them for a long time without a word. Then she said only, "Those are dairy cows." And Della said, "I know." And her grandmother said, "This was a dairy farm," and turned and walked back to the house, and that was all she said about it for a while. But Della understood it as the closest thing to a blessing the old woman was likely to offer. The first weeks were nursing, and nothing but nursing. The fever in the herd was low but stubborn, and Della called the county vet, a young man named Purvis, who drove out reluctantly and walked the pasture with his hands in his pockets, and told her, kindly enough, that she had bought a heap of trouble. He said the fever was manageable, but that they were run down and stressed from the hauling, and that some of them would not make it, and that even the ones that did would take months to come into any kind of condition, and that a dairy cow that had been off her milk and dry and sick for a season did not simply switch back on like a faucet. He gave her medicine and a schedule and a bill she paid out of the small savings she had left, and he said, not unkindly, that if she wanted his honest advice, she would salvage what she could and cut her losses. She thanked him for the medicine. She did not take the advice. She set an alarm for 4 in the morning, and she went out in the dark and the cold, and she started the long, unglamorous work of bringing 60 broken animals back from the edge. She learned each of their temperatures. She kept the notebook going, a page for every cow, ear-tag numbers she assigned herself since half of them had lost theirs, weights she estimated and then corrected, the color of their eyes, the sound of their breathing, which ones ate readily and which ones had to be tempted. She dosed them and she watched them and she moved them from paddock to paddock so they always had fresh grass. And she hauled water in the truck when the far trough would not fill, and she did all of it without ceremony and without any audience but her grandmother on the porch and the cows themselves. She lost 3 in the first 3 weeks. She had known she would lose some, and she had told herself she was prepared, and she was not prepared, not really. And the loss of the 3rd one, a red cow, that had seemed to be turning the corner and then simply lay down one evening and did not get up, hit her harder than she let show. She buried them at the top of the far pasture with the tractor, and she wrote the date beside their numbers in the notebook, and she drew a small line through the page, and she did not cry where anyone could see, because there was no one to see, and because crying did not feed the other 57. And the other 57 slowly began to turn. It was nothing dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was a cow that had refused grain for a week suddenly cleaning her bucket. It was the leaner, one morning in late April, standing on her own 4 feet in the middle of the pasture with her head up, chewing, her ears forward, looking at Della across the wet grass as though to ask what was for breakfast. It was coats that began to shine again where the sun hit them, and hips that began to fill, and the low, ragged sound of sick breathing giving way, one animal at a time, to the ordinary, contented sounds of cattle at grass. By the first week of May, Della walked the pasture at dawn and counted 57 head that were, if not yet thriving, at least alive and mending. And she stood at the fence with her coffee going cold in her hand, and she let herself feel for the first time something that was not quite hope, but was close enough to keep her getting up at 4. Her grandmother had watched all of this from the porch and from the kitchen window, and when the weather allowed, from a chair Della carried out to the edge of the near pasture, so the old woman could sit in the sun and see the animals. Ruth said little. She was economical with speech the way she was economical with every motion, spending nothing she did not have to spend. But she watched, and she saw. And one evening in the middle of May, when Della came in from the pasture and dropped into the chair at the kitchen table with the particular exhaustion of someone who had worked since before dawn, her grandmother set a plate in front of her, and then set down beside it a small crock covered with a cloth. Della lifted the cloth. Inside was butter, pale gold and dense, a color deeper than any butter she had seen in a store. Her grandmother said, "Taste it." Della spread it on the heel of bread that was on her plate, and ate, and stopped, and ate again more slowly, because the butter did not taste like butter she knew. It tasted like grass and cream and something richer underneath, something almost like nuts, a flavor that filled the whole of her mouth and stayed there. She looked up at her grandmother. Ruth had already turned back to the stove. Della asked where it came from, and her grandmother said, "From the 2 you started milking," because Della had, 10 days earlier, put 2 of the healthiest cows through the old milking stall she had repaired and cleaned, more to see if the equipment still ran than out of any real plan. and she had been giving the milk to the barn cats and the neighbors' hogs, and her grandmother, without telling anyone, had skimmed the cream and churned it in the old wooden churn that had sat in the pantry since before Della was born. Della asked why it tasted like that, why it was so different from anything she had bought in her life, and her grandmother, drying her hands on her apron, said the thing that turned out to be the key to everything that came after, though she said it the way she said everything, plainly, offhandedly, without any sense that she was handing over a treasure. She said, "Your grandfather picked this line of cattle for the cream, not the milk. The cream. He said the milk you could get from anything, but the cream, the butterfat, the taste that came from the blood, and this blood ran high in it, and no feed and no factory could put it in a cow that wasn't born with it. She said, those cows you dragged up the mountain, they came from his line, or near enough. Bad luck and bad handling nearly killed them, but the blood is the blood. She said, folks quit keeping cows like these because they don't fill a bulk tank the way the modern ones do, and the creamery pays by the gallon, not the flavor. So a cow that gives less but richer got called worthless, and got sold off cheap, and got scattered to slaughter yards 2 counties over." And she looked at Della with her pale, unhurried eyes, and she said, "You bought 60 cows nobody wanted because nobody wanted what they're best at." Then she sat down to her own supper and said nothing more, and Della sat there with the taste of that butter still in her mouth, and the whole shape of a thing she had not been able to name suddenly clear in front of her. And she took out her notebook and she wrote down, in her own hand under her grandfather's phrase, 3 words, built different. Butter. She did not rush. It was not in her to rush, and she had learned from the cows that rushing killed more than it saved. Through the rest of May and into June, she brought more of the herd into milk, a few at a time as they came into condition, and she cleaned and repaired the rest of the old dairy, so that by midsummer she was milking 22 head morning and evening, and drowning in cream she did not yet know how to sell. She read everything her grandfather had left. She read about churning temperatures, and about the difference between sweet cream butter and cultured butter, and she read her grandfather's own notes, where he had written down, decades ago, the exact way his mother had made the butter that had once won ribbons at the state fair. The way you let the cream ripen at a certain warmth for a certain number of hours until it soured just so. The way you churned it cool and washed it cold and worked it by hand until the last of the buttermilk was gone, so that it would keep. And her grandmother, who could no longer stand for long, sat at the kitchen table and directed with a few words and a pointed finger while Della's hands did the work. And between the old woman's memory and the dead man's notebook and Della's own patient stubbornness, they made, by the end of June, a butter that was better than the sample that had stopped Della cold at the supper table. It was pale gold and dense, and it tasted of the ridge itself. And when you spread it thin, it did not weep water the way store butter did, and when you left it on the counter through a warm afternoon, it held its shape and did not turn to grease, because it had been worked right and washed right and salted right, the old way, the way that had been called too slow to be worth the labor. That was the summer the heat came. It came in the last week of June, and it did not break for 6 weeks, the worst heat wave the county had seen in 30 years, day after day of temperatures that climbed past 100 and stayed there, nights that never cooled, a hard white sky and a dead stillness over the whole valley. It withered the corn in the bottomland, and it dried the shallow wells, and it laid the old men out on their porches in the shade fanning themselves and complaining, and it did something to the butter and the milk and the cream in every store and every kitchen in the county that nobody had thought about until it happened. The commercial butter, the soft whipped tubs, and the sticks from the plant down in the flatland turned. It went soft, and then it went off, in the heat, in the coolers that could not keep up with the load, on the counters where people set it out and forgot it. And folks who had never thought twice about butter found themselves throwing out ruined sticks and complaining at the store. And the store had no answer. because the whole supply chain was struggling in the heat and deliveries came late and warm. And in the middle of all of that, in a county where nothing would hold together in the heat, Della Hart had crocks of pale gold butter that sat on a plate through a 100-degree afternoon and did not slump and did not turn because it had been made the old way, worked dry and washed cold by a young woman who had refused to hurry. It started with the general store in the little town at the foot of the mountain, the store run by a woman named Pearl who had known Ruth Hart for 50 years. Della drove down one morning in early July with 6 crocks in a cooler, not because she had a business plan, but because she had more butter than her grandmother and the barn cats could eat, and because she thought Pearl might take a crock or two on the strength of the old friendship. Pearl tasted it standing at the counter, and she stopped, the way Della had St. Opt, and she looked at the crock, and then at Della, and then at the crock again, and she said, "This is Ruth's butter." And Della said, "My grandmother helped me make it." And Pearl said, "No, this is Ruth's butter. I have not tasted this in 40 years." And there was something in the older woman's face that was very close to grief and very close to joy at the same time. She bought all 6 crocks that morning and paid Della more than Della would have asked for them. And she set them on the counter by the register with a little card that said in Pearl's careful hand, "Hart Farm Butter, made the old way." And that was the last simple day, in a manner of speaking, because those 6 crocks were gone by noon. They were gone by noon because a woman named Loretta Sims bought 2 of them for a family reunion she was hosting that weekend, and she set one out on the picnic table in the dead center of the afternoon, while the store butter she had bought at the same time went to soup in its dish. And every one of the 40 people at that reunion noticed and asked and was told, "Hart Farm, up the mountain, made the old way." And the chef of the little cafe in the county seat, a man named Andre, who had trained in the city and come home to be near his mother, happened to be at that reunion because Loretta was his aunt. And he tasted that butter and went very quiet the way cooks go quiet when they encounter something real. And the following Monday he drove up the mountain in his own truck and found the farm at the end of the gravel road and knocked on the door and asked Della if she would sell to his cafe and how much she could make and whether she truly understood, what she had. Della, who was covered in the work of a July morning and had not expected anyone, wiped her hands on her jeans and looked at him for a moment in that long silent way she had, and then she said, "I understand it tastes good, and it keeps." And Andre laughed, not unkindly, and said, "It does more than keep," and he told her that in the whole miserable heat of that summer he had been unable to source a butter that would perform in his kitchen, that the commercial product was breaking on him at the stove and in the pastry, and that hers was the first butter he had touched in months that behaved the way butter was supposed to behave when it was made from real cream by hands that knew what they were doing. She sold him what she could, and she did not name a large price, because it was not in her nature to squeeze a man who was being honest with her, and Andre paid it and shook her hand and drove back down the mountain with a cooler of Hart Farm butter. And within a week, the little cafe in the county seat had a line out the door for the biscuits, and the biscuits were the same biscuits they had always made. But people were driving in from the next county over to eat them, because word had gone around, the way word goes around in a place like that, faster than any advertisement and truer, that the cafe had gotten hold of some butter that was unlike anything, some old-fashioned butter from a farm up the mountain that a girl had started from a herd of dying cows. Della did not do any of the talking. She never once, in all of it, told the story to a stranger or asked anyone to spread it or printed a flyer or built a sign larger than the small wooden one she nailed to the fence post at the end of the drive that said only Hart Farm, and under that, butter. The story spread on its own, hand to hand and mouth to mouth, because the thing at the center of it was real. And real things, given time, have a way of pulling people toward them without any pushing at all. By the last week of July, she was milking the whole herd that was healthy enough to milk, which was 51 of the 57 that had survived, and she had run out of hours in the day and out of hands, and she took on help. The help came in the form of a 15-year-old named Denny from the farm down the road, a quiet, watchful boy who reminded Della a little of herself, who showed up one morning on his bicycle and asked if she needed anybody, and stayed. She taught him to milk and to keep the stall clean and to watch the cows for the small signs of trouble. And he learned fast because he wanted to, and he took to sitting with the notebook in the evenings, checking her numbers, catching a cow that was off her feed before Della caught it. And her grandmother, from the kitchen table, ran the butter. Ruth Hart could no longer stand at the churn, but she could sit and she could taste, and she could smell the cream ripening and tell within a quarter hour when it was ready. And she could put her old thumb into a mound of worked butter and know at once whether the buttermilk was fully out of it, and she would say, "More," or she would say, "Enough," and she was never wrong. Della did the labor and Denny did the labor, but the judgment came from the old woman at the table, the judgment that had come down to her from her own mother and her husband and the whole long line of Harts who had made this butter on this ridge. And that judgment was the thing that could not be bought or hurried or faked, the thing that the plant down in the flatland with all its machinery and all its scale did not have and could not make. The men at the feed store noticed. Of course they noticed. In a county that size, nothing goes unnoticed, and the feed store on a Saturday morning was where all of it got sorted through and weighed and passed judgment on. And the big man in the cap, whose name was Wendell Cross, and who owned 400 acres of the best bottomland in the valley and a herd of the modern high-volume cattle that filled a bulk tank twice a day, had a great deal to say about Della Hart and her $3 cows and her butter. He said it was a fad. He said the heat had made people foolish and that when the weather broke they would go back to buying their butter at the store like sensible folks, cheaper and easier. He said a farm could not run on a boutique product for city people and reunion tables, that the real money was in volume, in the tank, in the check. The creamery cut you every 2 weeks, and that a girl who was milking 50 cows to make a few crocks of fancy butter by hand was working 3 times as hard for a third of the money and would learn that lesson soon enough. He said, and this was the line that Della's grandmother heard about and repeated to Della at the table one evening, with a small dry curl at the corner of her mouth. He said that patience was a fine thing for folks with nothing better to do, but that it never built a barn or bought a truck, and that this whole business would come to nothing, because nothing useful ever came from nothing useful, and 60 dying cows was about as close to nothing useful as you could get without an empty pen. Della listened to her grandmother repeat it, and she did not get angry, and she did not argue, because she had learned long ago that arguing with a man like Wendell Cross was like arguing with the weather, and because she had also learned that the only argument that ever changed a man like that was the kind you did not have to make out loud. She said that's one approach, and she went back out to the barn. August came, and the heat held, and the butter kept, and the demand did not fade the way Wendell had promised it would. It grew. Pearl at the general store could not keep it on the shelf and started a list of names, and people would drive up on the days Della delivered and wait in the parking lot for the cooler to come out of the truck. Andre's cafe was booked solid, and he had begun making his own butter-heavy pastries that he sold in boxes to take home, and he had started telling every food person he knew about the farm up the mountain, and one of those food people wrote a small piece in the regional paper. Not a big splashy thing, just a column about summer in the county, but it mentioned Hart Farm butter by name and called it the best butter the writer had ever eaten, and after that the driving in got worse, or better, depending on how you looked at it. Della hired a second helper, Denny's older cousin, and she bought a second churn, an old one she found at an estate sale that she rebuilt in the evenings, because she would not buy a machine, would not automate it, because the moment she automated it, she would lose the very thing that made it what it was. And she knew that the way she knew the light would come over the ridge in the morning. She kept it small. She let the demand pull the growth instead of chasing it with borrowed money. When people asked why she did not expand faster, why she did not take out a loan and double the herd and put in equipment and really make some money while the making was good, she said the same thing every time, which was that she would grow it the same way she grew everything, slowly, and she would let them know how it went. She had by then stopped pretending she had not named the cows. She had a name for every one of the 51, and the leaner, the black and white one who had leaned against the rail that first cold morning and would not load the first time, had turned out to be the finest cow in the herd, the deepest in cream, the one whose butterfat Ruth said was the highest she had tasted in 50 years, and Della had named her, without ceremony, after her grandmother. She did not tell her grandmother that for a long while. When she finally did, one evening in late August, the old woman was quiet for a moment and then said only, "She leans because she's tired, not because she's weak, and there is a difference, and most people can't tell it." And then she asked what was for supper, and that was the end of it. But Della understood that she had said the right thing. September came, and the heat finally broke, and the first cool morning felt like a door opening, and the corn that had survived came in thin, and the whole county exhaled. And the thing Wendell Cross had predicted, that the demand would break with the weather, did not happen. People had tasted the butter now. They did not go back. Pearl's list only grew longer, and the cafe stayed full, and the fall brought its own reasons, holiday bacon and gifts, and folks who wanted something real on the table when family came. And by October, Della was selling every ounce of butter she and her helpers and her grandmother's judgment could make. And she raised her prices finally, not out of greed, but out of arithmetic, because she could not make more without breaking the thing that made it good. And even at the higher price, it sold out the same day it appeared. October also brought the first year's reckoning, and Della sat at the kitchen table one night with her notebook and her grandfather's ledgers, and did the numbers, and found that the farm, which had been dead when she came to it in March, which she had bought back to life 60 dying cows at a time, had cleared more in butter that summer and fall than Wendell Cross's 400 acres of bottomland had cleared from the creamery tank, and she checked it twice, and she did not say anything, and she did not make a ceremony of it. She wrote the number in the notebook, and she closed the notebook, and she went to bed, and she got up at 4 the next morning and milked, because that was the work, and the work did not care what the number was. Wendell came up the mountain in November. He came alone in his own truck on a gray, cold afternoon, and he did not call ahead, and Della saw him coming from the barn, and she came out and wiped her hands and waited, because she was not going to make it easy for him, and she was not going to make it hard either. He got out of the truck, and he stood there for a minute looking at the pasture, at the 51 cows grazing the fall grass with their coats gone glossy and their hips filled out. Cows he had watched sell for $1 apiece 9 months before. Cows, he had said, would only ever produce a hole in the ground. And Della watched him look at them, and she saw him understand. He was not a cruel man. He was a conventional man, which is a different thing. A man who had believed what everyone around him believed and said it louder than most. And there is a particular kind of dignity in a man like that when he is finally standing in front of the proof of his own wrongness and has decided not to lie about it. He took off his cap, which was a thing Della had never seen him do, and he said, "I came to tell you I was wrong about your cows." He did not make a large production out of it. He said it the way you would state a fact offered for consideration, plainly. And then he stood there holding his cap. And Della, who could have said a great many things, who had earned the right to say a great many things, looked at him for a long moment in her silent way, and then said only, "They came from my grandfather's line. He picked them for the cream." And Wendell nodded slowly, and looked at the leaner, who had lifted her head to study him from across the fence, and he said, My daddy used to keep a few like that before the creamery told us all we were fools for it, and I let them go. We all let them go." And he was quiet, and then he said, "I don't guess you'd ever want to sell me a couple of heifers off that line come spring," and Della, understanding what it cost him to ask, said she would think on it, and that was as close to an alliance as the two of them ever came, and it was enough. He put his cap back on, and he said, before he got in his truck, that if she ever needed hay through a hard winter, she should call him and not think twice about it. And he meant it, and she knew he meant it, and he drove back down the mountain, and after that, the men at the feed store did not talk about Della Hart the way they had, because Wendell Cross did not, and in that county Wendell Cross set the weather of opinion. Her grandmother died in February, a year after Della had come up the mountain, quietly, in the night, in her own bed, in her own house, on the ground she had bled into. She had made butter with her hands and her memory and her judgment right up to the last week, sitting at the kitchen table with her thumb in the worked cream, saying more or enough, and being right. And then one cold week she was too tired to come to the table, and then she was gone. Della found her in the morning and sat with her a long while before she called anyone, and the sun came up over the ridge gold and slow the way it always did, indifferent and beautiful, and the cows lowed to be milked, and Della, when she had sat as long as she needed to, got up and went out and milked them, because that was the work, and the work did not stop for grief, and her grandmother of all people would have understood that. She buried her at the top of the far pasture, near where she had buried the 3 cows in the spring, in ground that looked out over the whole valley, and she wrote the date in the notebook, and she did not draw a line through anything, because some things you did not cross out. She found the note that spring, when she was going through the old crate of her grandfather's papers again, looking for a breeding record. It was folded inside the notebook with the phrase in it, a single sheet in her grandfather's cramped hand, and it had been there the whole time, and she had missed it, or perhaps she had not been ready to find it, and on it he had written, for whoever kept the place after him, a few plain sentences. He had written that the creamery would tell them the cream cows were worthless and to sell them, and that this was the biggest lie in the whole business, and that anyone with the patience to make the butter the old way would find that what the world called worthless was the only thing worth having. He had written, "Do not sell the cream line, no matter what they offer, and if they are gone, buy them back wherever you find them, because the blood is the blood, and it does not come again once it's scattered." And at the bottom, underneath, he had written, "Tell Ruth I was right," in a small dry hand that Della could hear as clearly as if the man she barely remembered were standing at her shoulder. And she sat down on the floor of that unused room with the note in her hand, and she wept, finally, for her grandmother and for the grandfather she had never really known, and for the whole long line of them who had known this thing and been called fools for it. And then she folded the note back into the notebook, and she got up, and she went out, and she milked the cows, because that was the work. She grew the farm the same way she had grown everything, slowly, without debt, letting the demand pull it. Denny stayed on and became a partner in all but name, and the second year she kept the best heifers back to build the herd from her own line rather than buying, and she sold 2 heifers to Wendell Cross in the spring at a fair price, and he kept his word about the hay through the hard winter, and the cafe in the county seat put Hart Farm butter on its menu by name, and Pearl at the general store never did manage to keep it on the shelf. 4 years after the morning she bought 60 sick cows for $3, Hart Farm butter had sold out at every store and market that carried it for 4 summers running, and it had sold out the whole county the summer of the great heat and every summer since. And the story of it had grown into the kind of thing people told strangers about the place. The girl who bought the dying cows nobody wanted and made the butter that would not melt, and it was true, all of it. And it had come from nothing that anyone but Della and an old man and an old woman had been able to see. On a cold morning in the 5th spring, Della drove down to the county livestock yard, the way she still did on sale days, and she climbed the rail on the shaded side, and she sat there with her boots hooked on the second board, and in the far pen, the pen for the animals that were closer to a problem than a purchase, there stood a small lot of thin, dull dairy cows that a modern operation had culled and nobody wanted. And Della looked at them a long time without saying anything, reading them the way she read a book she already suspected she would finish, and she saw in their frames the deep barrel and the wide pins, and the thing her grandfather had written about in the margins 60 years ago. And when the auctioneer's chant ran down to nothing and hung there in the quiet, she raised 2 fingers, and somewhere behind her a young man she did not know laughed a short bark of a laugh, and Della Hart smiled to herself because she had heard that laugh before, and she knew exactly how the story went. If anyone has ever told you that what you're holding isn't worth the trouble, that the thing you love is too slow or too small or too old-fashioned to matter, send this story to them, because they need to hear how it ends. Tell me in the comments about the thing in your life that people said was worthless, the thing you kept anyway, because I want to know, and tell me the town or the county you're watching from, because I like knowing where these stories travel and who's out there keeping the old things alive. I read every single comment, every one, and I'll be looking for yours.